Well, you don't have to listen to many episodes of this podcast to know that I'm a strong advocate for understanding the Apostle Paul within the Judaism of his day. But an essential part of that conversation is remembering that Jews in Paul's world lived side by side with pagans in Greco-Roman cities across the Mediterranean. In other words, to understand Paul as a Jew, we also have to understand him within the god-congested world of the Roman Empire. Well, today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Paula Fredriksen to talk about a fascinating new book that she co-edited titled Paul Within Paganism. Paul Within Paganism is an edgy topic, but understanding Paul in his Jewish and Greco-Roman context and how those contexts overlap can help us see Paul more clearly within his world so we can better understand him in ours. All right, Paula, welcome to the Bridge Builders Forum today. It is so great to have you. I'm excited to talk about this new book that you co-edited that I have right here beside me. It looks good sitting right here next to me, called Paul Within Paganism. So, of course, many people associate you with Paul within Judaism. So I guess you have a little bit of explaining to do, Paula, regarding which within team you're on here. So
I'm on both teams it turns out that both teams were intimately involved with each other. So
I know
the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. Okay, and we're going to dig further into that. So seriously, that's part of the fun and the significance of this conversation is that within Judaism, within paganism is not an either or, it's a both and we're going to talk all about that and how that works. But before we do that, for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Paula Fredriksen, she is a Jewish historian who specializes in the history of ancient Christianity and pagan Jewish-Christian relations in the Roman Empire. Paula has held distinguished positions at Boston University, at Hebrew University in Israel, and she's written numerous books that emphasize how pagans, Jews, and Christians interacted with their gods and each other. And I want to emphasize that for me personally, Paula's 2017 book that I have right here on my desk, Paul, the Pagan's Apostle. It really is one of the most impactful books on Paul that I've read. It's excellent. I highly recommend it. In my view, no one does it better than Paula when balancing the Jewish and Greco-Roman influences that shaped the Apostle Paul's perspective and his letters. So that's a good segue into our discussion today. And Paula, it is great to have you.
I'm delighted to be here.
All right. Thanks so much. Well, by the time this episode actually goes live, the new book that you co-edited that we've already mentioned, Paul Within Paganism, will have just been released. So I want to begin today, Paula, by discussing really the genesis and the meaning of the title and this designation, Paul Within Paganism. As we've already alluded to, Paul Within Paganism is not antithetical to Paul Within Judaism. These approaches work together. So I'd love for you to just get us started here to share, in sharing how Paul Within Paganism just naturally emerged from the Paul Within Judaism perspective. And along that, what do we mean here by seeing Paul's Judaism as within paganism?
Well, as you just said, it was a natural outgrowth of the effort to interpret Paul not against Judaism, but within Judaism, looking at Judaism not as his background, but as his context and a lot of his content. But as I and other scholars worked on that trajectory into interpreting Paul, we had to reconstruct that Jewish context, and it turns out that it was very comfortably located in the Greco-Roman world. I mean, to the point where we as scholars or as readers look back at that world and say, oh, this person's a pagan and this person's a Jew, and we put those into two different bins. But in fact, everybody was swimming in the same sea. And one of the big surprises for us was the degree to which the term monotheism is really inaccurate for describing how everybody related to superhuman powers in this world. And once that cracked things open, we started exploring all the different ways that Jews were comfortably integrated into majority culture. So we shouldn't even be distinguishing Jews from Greeks and Romans, because Jews were Greeks and Romans.
Yeah, yeah. I guess maybe a parallel would be, like today, Jews are also, they're Americans, and to think of, Jews living in America, we're very much embedded in the American culture as well. Would that be a comparable parallel?
Well, not really, because I think the idea of citizenship is a civic and legal concept, and I'm really talking about an organic cultural setting. It's different because we have a civil society that's secular, and that's quite different from ancient society. There were no secular societies.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we'll get into that further. So, Paula, many times I've heard you emphasize that it's really problematic to imagine Paul and other late Second Temple period Jews and Jewish communities as living in a bell jar, as if they were segregated and untouched by pagan ways of life that saturated the Mediterranean world. I guess put a little bit differently, there are good reasons to think that while Jews maintained their particularity, they also accommodated themselves to their larger Greco-Roman environment. So talk to us a little bit about, how do we know this? What's some of the evidence that indicates that the boundaries between Jews and pagans in the ancient world were maybe more porous than many assume? And how does that maybe impact our understanding of Jewish life in Paul's day?
I can't begin to explain how thick with gods Mediterranean culture was. And so everybody had their particular gods, and Jewish particularity stands out to us because Jews are still here. We're not worried about Phoenician particularity, but Phoenicians were particular too, right? It's just every ethnic group had its own particularities, but those were different idioms within a common language of what scholars are now in some desperation calling Mediterraneanness. Jews had to have social relations both with other peoples, as all other peoples did with each other, and with other people's gods. And what we have, particularly from inscriptions, is evidence of this type of interaction. For example, one of my favorites, there is a social formation in ancient Greco-Roman cities called the ephebate. It's where you dump your adolescent son out of the house into a gymnasium so he can grow up for the last 2 years of his adolescence. It's not a bad idea.
Yeah, right.
And these young men were called ephebes. And the two gods of the ephebate were brawn and brain. They were Hercules and Hermes. And what we have in an inscription stele is the list of names of the kids who were in an ephebate. And this is a place in North Africa. And there are Jewish names in those lists, which is interesting. It means that they are exercising and they are learning about pagan gods as part of their Greco-Roman education. And also, ephebes had civil responsibilities. They, when there were civic celebrations of the gods who were presiding over the city, ephebes would form a chorus and sing hymns to that god. And if these Jewish adolescents were also part of the ephebate, that means that they would have been involved with that. Now, does that make them naughty Jews? First of all, it probably depends on which Jew you ask. But secondly, it wouldn't make them stand out in their Greco-Roman context in the diaspora, because they're not sacrificing to those gods. They're acknowledging them, but they're not sacrificing to them. And sacrifice really was the bottom line in terms of allying yourself with a divinity. And so they are being polite to these other gods, but they're not worshiping them in a formal way.
Got it. So how about like things like meals? Would Jews, I think there's this perception that, in the ancient world, in Paul's day, maybe some people read certain texts in the New Testament in a certain way that, Jews and pagans or Gentiles wouldn't eat together. Do we have evidence that
We
maybe
have
some of that
evidence
was
of them
going on?
eating. Sure, they're eating together because we have Jews that are members of different types of assemblies that form in that are like trade unions almost, and they would be, eating together once a month or something like that, once every several months. And Jews are integrated into that type of social organization. I mean, did the Ephes bring tuna sandwiches with them to the Ephe bait? I don't think so. They probably were eating what everybody else was eating. Some Jews were very particular about food sacrifice, meat sacrificed to idols. Other Jews weren't. In other words, there was great variability then, just as there is now. The Acts of the Apostles also talk about God-fearers. And you wouldn't know this from the text, but you know this from inscriptions. God-fearers are fellow travelers. They're pagans who go to synagogue as pagans. They're not halfway converts. They're not disavowing their own gods. It's again, that Mediterranean both and combination. So there's mixing, although I'm sure, again, there's a spectrum of
Sure.
behaviors, just like there is now.
Yeah, yeah. Real quick before we move on, I think I just want to make sure to clarify. So what you're saying is that these God-fearers who had an interest in Judaism, maybe relationships in the synagogue, maybe went to synagogue some, they were still worshiping the gods, right? I mean, there was no expectation that they were going to worship the Jewish God only. Is that
That's
correct?
correct. They're showing respect to the Jewish God, and the synagogue was perfectly happy to have them do that. But again, another inscription.
Mm,
A favorite lady of mine, Julia Severa, built
mm.
the synagogue in her town of Akmonia. And her day job was she was a priestess in the imperial cult, worshiping the
Wow.
emperor. And so the community was very happy to have her be a patron of the community, and she was very happy to patronize the community. And she is an absolutely active pagan.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. So these inscriptions really tell us a lot about this mingling that was going on all throughout the Mediterranean, as you're saying. And
This mosaic is in a
oh,
synagogue, but these are pagan gods. These are
I
these are pagan gods.
that's
This is
and
the
this
wheel of heaven, and for example, Virgo is in the mosaic Betula. They're
got
the
yeah,
gods are Pisces is
crazy.
Dagim. That's Helios in the middle of the medallion.
And so
That's
this is what synagogue? Would you know where this what
Yeah, it's in
synagogue this
Beit
was in?
Alpha. It's in the land of Israel.
Oh my
It's
gosh.
a fourth century synagogue. That's how comfortable they are with lower gods. As long as there's a
Yeah.
hierarchy and your God's on top, there's just
Right.
not a problem. But the fact that that's how domesticated pagan gods were for the Jewish imagination. You could have this on the floor of a synagogue. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
that's wild. That's wild. Yeah, and I know, for people who have toured Israel, like I've been, to a lot of the old synagogues, and you see there's pagan stuff all over the synagogues there. It's wild. I
It's
mean, it's so unexpected because we just don't, again, it's that bell jar thing, right?
right.
It's
In
we're
our imaginations, we've dichotomized something that was like this.
yeah.
Yeah.
If you're enjoying this conversation, I want you to know that the Bridge Builders Forum is more than just a podcast. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other. Your support helps us host these vital conversations and create educational resources and interactive learning experiences. And yes, all donations are tax deductible. To give, just visit bridgebuildersforum.com and click donate. Every gift makes a difference. So thanks for standing with us. And if we can serve you in any way, send us a message. So this new book, Paul Within Paganism, I find it so interesting and helpful for understanding Paul. And it suggests that Paul's letters actually serve as an example of the kind of extensive mingling that we're talking about here between Jews and pagans that was common in the Greco-Roman world of the late Second Temple period. And along this line, there was a particular statement that caught my attention I want to ask you about. The line was, and this was in the introduction of Paul within paganism. It said, Paul operated within paganism, even at his most Jewish points. Now, understandably, that might grind some gears, I know, as you like to say sometimes. So I want to discuss that a little bit. How do we see Paul expressing himself in a most Jewish way while also operating within paganism?
Well, let's talk about the idea of a Messiah and the idea of the resurrection of the dead. And what Paul is talking about when he's saying that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. The Davidic Messiah is a warrior figure. And what Paul is saying is that when Christ comes back, what he's going to do is defeat pagan gods. He says that in 1 Corinthians 15, where he defeats every authority and ruler and power, which sounds like terrestrial entities, but they're not. Those are words for the cosmic spheres that, remember, it's a geocentric universe. The heliocentric universe is pretty recent for us, right? So it's a geocentric universe. These are cosmic layers that are like energy shells around the earth that are associated with pagan gods. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Christ will destroy those forces when he comes back. In Philippians 2, he says that those knees above the earth, upon the earth, and below the earth, so those are superhuman knees, will all bend to Christ when he comes back, to the glory of God the Father. So they're either rehabilitated or simply conquered. But this idea of the kingdom of God ending history is, you can't get much more Jewish than that. And yet here it is, part of the Mediterranean playbook of these pagan gods being integrated into the final scenario. Finally, when Paul's talking about resurrection, he says it's we sow our fleshly body, and it's like a seed. What grows out of that is a body made of pneuma, made of spirit, which is material, very fine matter. It's like protoplasm almost in antiquity. And so you get a spiritual body, and spiritual body, this may or may not help, if you think of club soda and you unscrew the top of the bottle and the bubbles naturally rise up to the top. That's what pneuma does. It takes you to the realm beyond the moon, up to the realm of the upper heavens and the stars, which is where he says, again in Philippians 3, is the commonwealth, it's our commonwealth. So his idea of resurrection is people getting star bodies and going up to the realm below the moon. Again, resurrection is a fundamentally Jewish idea. He's parsing it in a way that makes sense to his contemporaries.
I think also that I know a verse that text in 1 Corinthians that you emphasize a lot, where Paul says there are many gods and many lords. Yet for us, there is but one God, right? So it's like, that's another pretty big one where he's painting this allegiance to the God, to the Jewish God, but he's doing it while acknowledging the other gods. Is that another verse that you find?
Absolutely. He's
one, right?
using a regular indicative tense and voice there. There are many gods and many lords, but for us. So he's talking about allegiance in a crowded field. He also in 1 Corinthians 10 talks about tells his Gentiles not to partner with pagan gods by eating in a temple during a pagan ceremonial. He's saying don't do that anymore. In other words, he's having tougher criteria of joining his group than the synagogue would have had. But he's saying that you literally partner with these pagan gods if you eat to show allegiance to them in their temple. So that's how real these forces are for him.
And this is the kind of stuff that got him into some trouble. And so I want to talk a little bit about that because it affected his message, as you emphasized in Paul the Pagan's Apostle book so vividly and clearly. Is that his Jewish message affected both Jews and Gentiles within the pagan world in which he operated. And you talk about in this book, you describe his message as destabilizing and even inflammatory, not just for Jews, but very much for his Gentile audience as well. So I want to start with the Gentile side. As you've noted, Gentiles engaging Jewish teachers or practices, it wasn't unusual in many Greco-Roman cities. So that alone, I guess, wouldn't have triggered, alarm bells, but something about Paul did trigger alarms. So why did Gentile civic leaders and even regular citizens find Paul's message, let's just say, socially disruptive? And how would this have affected the Gentiles who did embrace his message?
Such a good question, because that's where the rubber meets the road. Where is this a distinctively new type of religious movement? And it's the social disruption that's the register of that. The word for Gentile and the word for pagan is the same word in Greek, ta ethne. It's the root of our word ethnic, right? Yeah. So there are no religiously neutral ethnicities in antiquity. If you're a member of an ethnic group, you come packaged together with your gods. And gods also are part of government. There is no distinction between religion and politics. Governance is a religious activity because you are performing acts of respect to the gods that look after the city, so that the gods will look after the city, you look after the gods. What Paul is doing is disrupting this very nice ecosystem.
Yeah.
Jews had a past because everybody knew there was, Jews had this thing about not worshiping other gods. And it's something that Josephus gives descriptions of different cities that made different arrangements for their Jewish populations. But their Jews showed respect to gods, but they didn't actually worship them. Paul is saying that pagans may not worship their own gods anymore, and that disrupts this political, religious ecosystem of the city, so that people responsible for the governance of the city and residents of the city would be anxious that the gods would be alienated and would therefore and you don't want an alienated God on your back in Roman antiquity. Right. You just want to avoid that. So that would cause a frisson of anxiety for the pagan population. Meanwhile, what it does, if you have this man running around saying you should worship only for us, the God of Israel, that would be associated immediately with the synagogue. So alienating the gods puts the city at risk, but alienating the city puts the synagogue at risk. And that's why I think Paul was subjected to community discipline. We don't know in what Jewish communities, but 5 times, he says, he received the 39 lashes, and they're trying to get him to be quiet.
Yeah.
Good luck.
No, good luck. Right. Yeah. No, and I know you talk about how one of the ways in ancient Greco-Roman cities that you kept your city safe by keeping the gods happy, right? And so if all of a sudden Paul is saying that Gentiles can't worship, don't worship the gods anymore, boy, who are you going to blame, right? If all of a sudden famine, earthquake, sickness, whatever it might be comes, they're going to blame Paul, but this is a Jewish message, right? So right. I could see how this is wreaking havoc.
And it also disrupts the city. There's a great scene in Ephesus in the Acts of the Apostles. I'm not saying it actually happened, but it's a plausible scene where Paul causes a riot, and the citizens of Ephesus rally and say, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," because it's like, our God's as good as, is bigger than your God type of argument. But they're upset about his roiling the waters, so to speak, of the city. And if you're a Roman magistrate, you don't want civic unrest. Your job as a Roman magistrate is to keep the lid on the pot. So that's why Paul is subject to being beaten with rods, which is a Roman punishment. In the same passage in 2 Corinthians 11, beaten with rods 3 times. The magistrate is saying, you've got to shut up.
Yeah.
Of course, Paul doesn't.
Yeah. He doesn't. So I want to just press in a little bit more on what would the fallout have been for the people who did actually, for his Gentiles that did embrace his message. I know the way you've put it in many times is they were in this proverbial, no man's land, right? And so talk a little bit about these Paul's Gentiles who embraced this message. How did they negotiate this?
Well, what's interesting, there are lots of interesting things about this, but interestingly, Paul is saying that Gentiles who join the movement do not have to become Jews. They don't have to go through a process of conversion. So that they remain Gentiles, but they remain these Gentiles in, as you just put it, a social no man's land. Now, antiquity was not a modern police state. Nobody was walking around checking on who was doing what religiously. But if there were a flood, if there were a famine, if there were an earthquake, these people would be blamed because obviously it meant that the gods were angry. And that's the price, I think, that people pay. Nero, when the fire in Rome breaks out in 64, blames Christians for that, and because people don't like them.
Right.
They endanger things.
Yeah, they endanger things because they're not doing their part to keep the gods happy, I guess, is what I hear you emphasizing and what we see. But I guess for Paul, in his mind, the end was, coming very, very soon. So whatever fallout there was, whatever the consequences were it was worth it.
Right. He says in Romans 13 to obey, government, keep your head down and your powder dry. Just be quiet socially. But this, again, when things go wrong, and things go wrong a lot, that would put into prominence these non-participating Gentiles. Jews always had a pass, but Christ-following Gentiles who were part of Paul's aspect of the movement would be vulnerable to popular distrust.
Yes, and it makes all the sense in the world because they didn't get that pass. They don't get that pass. They're still, Paul says, you're members of the nations, and so they don't get that pass socially. So I understand they're in a really precarious position. Right.
To their pagan peers, they would just look like deviant pagans.
Deviant pagans. Yeah. Yeah. I want to drill in a little bit also, Paula, on the Jewish side, because again, this brought instability on the Gentile side, but you've already touched on it a little bit. So you mentioned in 2 Corinthians 11, we see Paul talking about the discipline he received from the Jewish community. And so we know that based on what we read, they were understandably, there was a lot of concern. So talk to us a little bit about the nature and sort of the precarious place that these Jewish communities in these various cities had, and how Paul really, once they understood what he was saying, why were they so, passionate about shutting him down?
Well, I think the synagogue had settled comfortably into the urban landscape, and they welcomed pagans into their communities, and that's who the God-fearers are. And we have lots of inscriptions about God-fearers who are pagans who are participating also with Jewish stuff. Remember, pagans could also go to the temple in Jerusalem. The largest courtyard of the temple was the court of the nations. So there's this fluidity, and I also almost like a camaraderie that, I worship my God, you're worshiping your gods. I won't worship your God, but I will show respect to your God. And meanwhile, pagans are showing respect to the God of Israel. By having a message that you can only worship the God of Israel, only, even if you're not Jewish, that's going to sound like it's emanating from the synagogue. And that's going to begin to unsettle the place of the synagogue in the city. And that's why I think Paul had headwind, not only from Roman magistrates, but also from Jewish authorities.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can understand the anxiety there, because any way you slice it, it's not like they can pin it to Christianity, right? They can't say, oh, go, this is a Christian message that wasn't present yet.
There is no word for Christians in Paul's lifetime.
Right. So they know this is a Jewish message. And so if this is, it's understandable that the synagogue authorities were wanting to keep the peace and keep that balance there.
Right. I mean, who worships the God of Israel? The Jews.
Right. Paula, one of the hallmarks of your work has been challenging the prevailing view that Paul's gospel triumphed or replaced the Jewish law, the Torah. And you've consistently argued and made a very persuasive case, as well as your other colleagues in the Paul within Judaism perspective and school of thought. You've made the case also that Paul remained faithful to the Torah and promoted it both before and after becoming the apostle of the Gentiles. So if Paul didn't view Jesus as triumphing over the law, I want to hear your thoughts on what victory he did believe was actually accomplished. And I'm using that language of triumph and victory deliberately so that you might connect this to what you wrote about in your essay in Paul within Paganism about Pauline polytheism and the triumph of the Davidic Messiah. So talk to us about that.
Well, Paul needs pagan gods for his eschatological scenario to be realized. Because if Christ comes back and he doesn't fight anybody, he's not a Davidic Messiah. I mean, being a triumphant warrior is part of the job description of being a Davidic Messiah. Jesus, the first time through, ended up on a cross, and he triumphed over death and sin, says Paul, demonstrated through his resurrection. But that's never the full stop of his message. Because Christ has been raised, he is about to come back, says Paul, and he's going to finish the job and defeat the pagan gods. So he absolutely requires the pagan gods to articulate his theological convictions about Jesus as Christ.
No, I think that's such a helpful layer that is often missing, that this emphasis Paul within paganism truly brings out. Because I think the perception is that, however people articulate it, when Jesus comes back, he's going to defeat earthly rulers. But a key emphasis here is that part of being the Davidic Messiah is defeating the gods, these superhuman rulers as well, is what I hear you saying.
Absolutely. And again, with Philippians 2, they're bending their knee, which could be a kind of rehabilitation, right? In Romans 8, Paul says that neither depth nor height nor angels and he lists other cosmic powers. None of that can keep us separated from God and Christ. So he's looking at these pagan gods as opponents who are on borrowed time.
I'm excited about this approach, Paul within paganism. It just helps us. It's kind of like once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? From the standpoint of all of a sudden, as I'm reading through these letters and studying and so forth, I see all these references that he makes to these superhuman entities, and that was a huge part of what he thought, the Davidic Messiah, Christ, gains victory over. And so I think that's why I appreciate this emphasis.
Right. Paul's main message is not don't get circumcised. Paul's main message is stop worshiping native gods and worship only the God of Israel. And that's his main message.
That's his main message. Yeah. No, thank you. That's again, super clear. So I want to talk a little bit more about this book. I'm sure one of the benefits of co-editing a volume like Paul within Paganism is engaging with the perspective of other scholars who are wrestling with this same question. So I'm sure each contributor, brought something valuable to the table. But were there one or two essays in particular in Paul within Paganism that you found particularly illuminating or helpful for you? Yeah.
Ones that absolutely, wow, I hadn't thought of that. I mean, it's wonderful to have these collaborative projects because it's the best way to think outside your own head is by thinking with the benefit of somebody else's. So I think two of the essays that really turned me around was one of them that talked about, let me read you the sentence. I have the book.
Yeah, please.
It shocked me. Paul did not just believe in multiple gods. He believed that the gods were multiplying.
Huh.
What does that mean?
Oh, yeah, what does that mean?
It means that Paul talks about pagans being ex-pagans being adopted as sons of God. That's why even the pagans get to call God Abba, Father. Mm-hmm. They become sons of God. Sons of gods are also gods in antiquity. And gods have bodies made of pneuma, this material spirit. Gods are up in the with the stars and the planets above the realm of the moon. And so they're becoming, the saints who are resurrected are becoming minor key. They're not as big as the biggest God, obviously.
Sure.
But they are becoming, in a sense, deified by in the idiom of Mediterranean piety. That's what's happening. So that I hadn't thought of resurrection that way. That really blew me away. And another essay concerns Paul's use of military language. And it's particularly about the word pistis, which is often translated as faith, which conjures an image of an interior intellectual and ethical state. You believe strongly or sincerely or something like that. Pistis in the first century means loyalty or fealty to, faithfulness in. And Paul's talking about the obedience of loyalty. He's using martial, in other words, he's putting forth the virtues of a Roman soldier to his pagan audience, saying that when they need pistis, he's not saying you got to have faith. He's saying you have to have loyalty.
Yeah.
So that really reconfigures the relationship between humans and gods. I mean, it's really about allegiance.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I haven't read that essay yet, so I'm looking forward to digging into that one. That sounds really interesting. Well, I'm sure it was fun to read through all of them. So thanks for sharing some of your insights. I'm going to ask you one more question in just a second, but you've used the term a couple times, and I really should have probably put it in the script, but I want to make sure folks understand because this is one of your hallmark phrases, ex-pagan pagans. Just take a moment, Paula, just make sure that we define what you mean by that, because that's a really important paradigm as we're talking about Paul and so forth. When you say that, what do you mean by that?
Well, what I'm trying to do is collapse the wiggle room that we have in English between Gentiles and pagans, because it's translating the same word in Greek. Gentiles just sounds ethnically neutral. The person is not a Jew. He's a Gentile. But there is no such thing as a religiously neutral Gentile in antiquity. They're pagans. And the word pagan, which is a 4th century neologism that's a term of disrespect that Christians come up with to try to distinguish what they're doing from Mediterranean culture by naming aspects of it, quote, pagan. Peoples are intrinsically connected to their gods. So even when a pagan stops worshiping the gods he's been born into a relationship with, he's still a pagan. He's still a pagan, but he's an ex-pagan because he's not worshiping the gods anymore. So I wanted it to be a little jarring because I wanted people to stop and think about what this group was like.
Right. No, I appreciate that. Thank you for taking just a moment to define that. I think that folks who haven't heard that phrase before will find your definition helpful. And so thank you for that. So Paul, as we wrap this up, I'd love to just discuss just some implications a little bit. In your view, what difference does this make as far as understanding Paul within paganism? What difference does it make for modern readers and interpreters? And in other words, why would you say this perspective matters as we approach Paul's letters?
First of all, I'm a historian, so I think reconstructing the past is always a good thing to do. I think particularly for modern communities, what it does is teach, I think, a certain kind of humility in approaching sacred texts. Because when these texts were born, they didn't mean what they mean to communities now. So that thinking about a world full of gods, thinking about a world of star bodies, it gives you an appreciation, I think, of the type of work of reinterpretation of canonical texts that goes into being self-consciously religious. And I think that's a good thing. That type of humility toward one's own tradition is probably a good thing.
Yeah, for sure. I think it just shows us how this is one of the things I appreciate about this perspective, Paul, within paganism, is it really does show us how different Paul's world was from ours, and that brings into that humility. We have to, just to really do the hard work of trying to get back so that we can, I know as you've aimed to do in so many ways, so that we can try to understand Paul on his own terms. And I think this is a helpful way to do that.
He's an endlessly fascinating figure, and he's worth the effort.
He's worth the effort for sure. Well, Paula, I just want to thank you for your time with us today, and not just for joining me today, but also just for the clarity, for the rigor that you continue to bring to Pauline studies, especially as we seek to understand Paul in his Jewish and Greco-Roman context, and how those two things go together, overlap intimately. And, your work has helped shape how many of us approach Paul on his own terms, and today's conversation is just really only reinforced how essential that effort is. So it's been an honor to have you on the Bridge Builders Forum. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Hey, I would love to connect with you further, so feel free to leave a comment or send me a private message. And the best way for us to stay in touch is to sign up for the Bridge Builders Forum email at bridgebuildersforum.com. This will keep you informed of cutting-edge resources and opportunities for us to connect and learn together. Additionally, the Bridge Builders Forum is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and your support helps us create content that overcomes misunderstandings and advances ideas that build bridges between Jews and Christians. We'll be back soon to discuss more ideas that help Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other.